If you only looked at Africa's resources, you might assume it should be the wealthiest place on Earth. Oil, diamonds, cobalt, fertile land, you name it. Yet in 2025, many countries across the continent still sit at the bottom of global wealth charts. Even as the African Development Bank projects growth of around 4.3% this year, among the fastest in the world, hundreds of millions of Africans remain in extreme poverty. Economists often call this the resource curse, but the explanation goes deeper. We'll use an institutional framework, drawing on work by leading MIT researchers, to show why natural wealth alone doesn't translate into prosperity. Factors like extractive institutions, governance failures, and the unforgiving math of debt all shape outcomes. Understanding why this gap exists is the key to seeing the paradox that defines Africa's economy today. The paradox of plenty. This puzzle is often called the paradox of plenty. Africa holds some of the most valuable natural endowments in the world: oil basins, diamond mines, rare minerals critical for modern technology. Yet average incomes remain among the lowest anywhere. By conventional logic, such wealth should fuel broad prosperity. But the record shows the opposite. Resources bring windfalls, while ordinary people see little improvement in their daily lives. It's like standing in a massive orchard, but never controlling who picks or sells the fruit. You're surrounded by abundance, yet still go hungry. Economists describe this as the resource curse, and the mechanics are straightforward. A country strikes oil or discovers gold, and leaders promise transformation. At first, revenues surge and spending expands. Yet instead of building diverse economies, nations often become locked into one volatile source of income. When prices soar, governments splurge. When they collapse, budgets implode. It's reminiscent of a lottery winner who celebrates with cars and mansions, only to end up worse off because they forgot to plan. This dependence changes how governments and citizens interact. Resource rents become the state's main lifeline. Leaders no longer need broad tax systems to fund national spending, which means fewer demands for accountability. Without taxes binding citizens and state, transparency and representation weaken. Money still pours in, but it funnels upward, concentrating power and wealth rather than spreading it widely. That's how you get billion-dollar export sectors existing alongside schools without supplies or cities with high unemployment. There's also the volatility problem. Zambia's copper output, Nigeria's oil exports, or Ghana's reliance on gold all hinge on prices set in London or New York, outside their control. A downward price shock can undermine government budgets overnight, triggering cuts to social services or, in some cases, debt defaults. Foreign investors read this instability as risk, which discourages long-term capital. If you're a young professional in one of these economies, this isn't an abstract issue. Price swings determine whether jobs remain stable, whether savings hold value, and whether governments can commit to sustained investment. Many African economies lean heavily on just one or two raw exports. On paper, it looks strong when demand surges, but the moment global conditions shift, the entire economic structure shows its fragility. Contrast that with countries built on a broader mix: manufacturing, services, agriculture, tourism. And the difference is clear. Concentration creates vulnerability. And unlike industries that scale employment to large populations, extraction sites rarely hire broadly. Oil rigs and mines may generate vast revenue, but limited jobs. GDP numbers may rise, while unemployment barely budges and inequality worsens. Even when jobs do emerge, they are usually specialized, not spread across the general workforce. The result is a mismatch: impressive export receipts that don't filter down into greater opportunities for most households. This imbalance plays out across daily life. Teachers may see their wages tied to the oil market. Farmers may watch fertilizer costs spike when government budgets collapse, and families face an economy that lurches unpredictably rather than moving steadily upward. Corruption deepens the problem. Easy access to concentrated resource rents tempts governments to use revenues for political advantage rather than development. Oil, gas, or mining royalties can become tools to consolidate power, fund patronage networks, or divert into private accounts. Instead of schools and hospitals, money disappears into stalled projects or luxury living among elites. The idea of a curse feels less like a metaphor and more like the lived reality for ordinary citizens. Resource booms can also distort other industries through what economists call Dutch disease. When resource dollars flow in, the local currency strengthens. Manufacturing and farming products become uncompetitive abroad. Factories close, and other sectors lose ground. In Africa, where institutions often lack the strength to counterbalance those effects, governments slide into a dependency trap, stuck exporting raw commodities while broader development stalls. Yet resources don't seal a country's fate. Botswana provides a crucial counterexample. After gaining control of its diamond reserves, it built strong fiscal policies, directed income into public investment, and maintained relatively clean governance standards. Growth there shows that natural wealth doesn't automatically derail stability. Policy choices do. This contrast underlines the most important lesson. It's not the resource itself, but the institutions managing it that shape outcomes. The stakes are personal. Commodity volatility doesn't just appear in government spreadsheets. It controls whether jobs are secure, whether money saved today holds value tomorrow, and whether public services can survive downturns. For someone trying to plan a future, start a business, or even open a savings account, an economy tied tightly to oil or copper feels like building on shifting sand. Structural weakness bleeds into everyday uncertainty. Africa's paradox of plenty, therefore, isn't simply about economics. It's about systems that turn natural wealth into a cycle of fragility. Enormous reserves coexist with poverty because leadership structures, historical conditions, and global market exposure shape outcomes more than the resources themselves. Some countries have started to confront these traps, but most still find themselves vulnerable to the same boom and bust patterns. And those vulnerabilities have roots older than oil rigs or diamond mines. To see why so many African economies start from such fragile ground, we need to look at the way the states themselves were built, their borders, their political foundations, and the institutions designed to govern them. Borders that never made sense. Why do so many African borders run straight across deserts, forests, and mountains as if drafted with a ruler? A quick glance at a map shows it clearly. Countries like Chad, Mali, and Sudan carry lines that pay no attention to rivers, cultural regions, or communities. Unlike in Europe, where boundaries often reflected centuries of war, negotiation, or geography, most African borders were imposed during the colonial partition of the late 19th century. They were agreed upon in distant meeting rooms, not shaped by the people who actually lived on the land. This mattered because those lines divided societies that had shared languages, traditions, and trade routes for centuries. Families were split into different jurisdictions. Merchants who once moved freely across markets now faced barriers, tariffs, and checkpoints. Entire communities that saw themselves as one were forcibly separated, while groups with little shared history were bundled into a single political unit. The result: fractured states where national identity and economic integration are weak. Colonial powers had little interest in building states that could stand on their own. Their focus was resource extraction. Railways and ports were laid out not to connect towns with each other, but to funnel raw materials to the coast, ready for export overseas. Many rail lines and ports were built during colonial rule to move resources out, not to link local markets, so post-independence states inherited fragmented trade maps. Infrastructure bypassed inland economies, reinforcing disconnection between regions. Once independence movements succeeded in the mid-20th century, new African governments inherited these arbitrary borders and patchwork systems. Redrawing them was discouraged, partly to avoid sparking new conflicts, but also because the international community preferred stable maps. That left leaders governing territories without natural cohesion, forced to administer populations that often had deeper loyalty to local communities than to the abstract idea of a nation. This structural mismatch translated into fragility. Countries where one ethnic group dominated politics produced resentment among others, often leading to uprisings, coups, or separatist efforts. Governments struggling to maintain cohesion diverted scarce budgets into military and security spending, draining resources away from infrastructure or education. Potential foreign investors looked at these repeated internal conflicts and concluded that risk outweighed opportunity. In practice, weak national identity, coupled with inherited political borders, slowed both stability and development. There are exceptions. Some African states managed to cultivate stronger national unity across diverse groups, often through deliberate policy choices or by rallying around common experiences, such as liberation struggles. But many others remained shaped by divisions imposed more than a century ago. Instead of fostering inclusivity, governments frequently leaned on extractive approaches that concentrated resources in the hands of elites, a pattern that mirrored colonial rule. This reinforced inequality and made fragile states even weaker. The economic costs are visible. Borders that cut through historical trade networks disrupted commerce. In parts of West Africa, merchants who had exchanged goods for centuries suddenly faced customs posts and artificial constraints. It often became easier and more profitable to smuggle across borders than to trade legally. That eroded state revenues and allowed corruption to flourish within border enforcement. Over time, fragmented markets made it harder for African businesses to grow large enough to compete globally. Instead of one integrated regional economy, the continent is still divided into dozens of small and costly trade systems. The challenges extend to state capacity too. When colonial authorities built administrative systems, they designed them to extract wealth, not to create efficient governance or provide public services. After independence, these skeleton systems were passed on. Without traditions of accountability or strong bureaucratic culture, post-colonial governments struggled to arbitrate disputes fairly or manage the demands of such diverse populations. When communities felt excluded, their trust in the central government collapsed quickly. This dynamic explains why artificial borders so often overlap with weak institutions and fragile states today. Development projects in the modern era still collide with these mismatched borders. Building highways, bridges, or energy projects across multiple countries often sparks disputes over who funds what, which region benefits, or how revenues should be split. These obstacles stem directly from state boundaries that ignored trade routes and economic logic in the first place. Instead of cooperating on integrated networks, nations argue over dividing shares of limited projects. The legacy is not only material but psychological. For many, the nation's boundaries don't feel like something that represents them. Loyalty gravitates toward local groups, while the broader idea of citizenship remains abstract. In turn, politics is often interpreted less as a contest over ideas than as a zero-sum game between communities. Elections risk being seen as tribal competitions, where losing power means exclusion rather than policy change. That sense heightens the likelihood of conflict and undermines the stability that democratic institutions require. By 2025, the imprint of colonial boundaries remains obvious. Disputes over resources near borders still flare between countries. Within states, the divisions carved long ago continue to sap trust and limit cohesion. Leaders spend more energy trying to hold together fragmented societies than pushing forward sustained development. While the colonial borders may once have been drawn to simplify maps for European powers, today they complicate governance and weaken attempts at broad-based growth. These artificial lines did more than create awkward maps. They left behind weak national identities, distorted trade patterns, and administrative systems crafted for extraction rather than inclusion. And those legacies flow directly into the deeper problem: the design of institutions themselves, and how they shape who gains and who loses inside these states. Institutions that extract, not build. Why do some nations with little arable land or scarce resources manage to build wealth, while many parts of Africa with abundant assets remain poor? The difference often lies not in geography, but in the systems that shape how resources are used. Prosperity depends on the rules that determine who can participate, how fairly disputes are resolved, and whether investments are protected. When those frameworks are reliable, citizens and businesses take risks to innovate. When they are tilted toward a small elite, opportunities narrow, initiative stalls, and growth slows. Economists describe this as the divide between inclusive and extractive institutions. Inclusive systems create conditions where most people can contribute and benefit. Extractive systems concentrate wealth and authority in the hands of a few, often through mechanisms designed to preserve control rather than generate opportunity. This distinction is central to the research by Asemoglu and Robinson in Why Nations Fail, which we'll lean on here. Their studies found that institutions explain much more of the global income gap than geography or climate. If property rights and fair rules are secure, innovation is rewarded. If they are not, development falters. A clear way to picture the difference is through a game analogy. Imagine Monopoly played under two sets of rules. In the first, everyone follows the same standards from start to finish, so long-term planning is possible. In the second, one player changes the rules at will, seizing properties or exempting themselves from rent. Under that system, no one else has an incentive to. Invest because gains can be stripped away. Growth accrues only to the rule maker. Economies with extractive institutions work much the same way. By contrast, Botswana structured its diamond revenues under relatively inclusive rules, strong contracts, predictable reinvestment, and mechanisms to limit elite capture. The result was steady, long-term growth, proving that resources can build prosperity when institutions support fairness. The historical roots of Africa's extractive systems lie in colonialism. European administrations built courts, taxes, and bureaucratic offices to facilitate extraction rather than foster competition or protect rights. Railways and ports, as noted earlier, were engineered to funnel exports abroad rather than integrate local economies. When independence arrived, new governments often retained these extractive blueprints. Leaders who inherited power had little incentive to dismantle them. Instead, many stepped into the role of gatekeepers, maintaining structures that concentrated wealth. These legacies hardened over time, leaving citizens in systems where building anything new was risky, while securing favors from elites seemed safer. The everyday consequences are visible throughout the continent. Farmers hesitate to shift into higher-value crops when they worry about unfair government pricing boards. Skilled entrepreneurs limit their ambitions when they doubt contracts will be enforced in court. Banks allocate loans based on connections rather than sound business plans. Under these conditions, talent is either wasted or exported. The economy cannot capture the energy of its workforce because the rules penalize initiative and channel rewards narrowly upward. Extractive rules also erode trust. To run a business in such environments, participants must add layers of protection, side payments, personal guarantees, informal networks, before taking any risk. These costs slow down growth projects and disincentivize new entrants. In turn, the absence of trust increases the cost of governance as well. Without faith in fairness, citizens resist paying taxes or obeying regulations, assuming they mainly enrich those at the top. Governments then struggle to mobilize resources internally, pushing them toward external borrowing or heavy reliance on volatile resource rents. Inclusive systems flip those dynamics. Secure property rights assure farmers that their harvest belongs to them at market prices. Independent courts signal that contracts stand a chance of being honored. Transparent public budgets show where tax money is spent, giving citizens a reason to comply. These features make ordinary people more likely to start businesses, invest savings, or seek credit. They connect institutional design directly to personal finance and jobs. The more rules reduce uncertainty, the more individuals feel safe betting on their own future. This explains why resource scarcity alone is not a barrier. Countries with limited natural wealth but stronger institutions, such as well-enforced property rights or impartial courts, develop industries to create value beyond what the land provides. By contrast, countries with fertile land and rich mines but extractive rules fail to translate assets into sustained broad-based wealth. Leading research argues institutions explain much more of this difference than geography or climate ever could. That doesn't mean extractive systems are permanent. History shows they can evolve. Over time, citizen pressure combined with external incentives can push governments toward accountability. The transition is rarely easy. Entrenched elites resist losing privileges. But when reform takes hold, the results are dramatic. Investment capital arrives, entrepreneurs return or stay, and growth spreads beyond resource pits. Inclusive transitions turn youthful populations into an advantage rather than a liability, creating labor forces ready to fuel new industries. Africa's challenge remains bridging that transition. Establishing credible reforms requires both leadership restraint and citizen confidence. Cosmetic changes, laws that remain unenforced or oversight bodies without authority, do little to shift behavior. But when signals are clear that rules apply broadly and consistently, trust accumulates. International partners also play a role. Rewarding long-term accountability rather than short-term export volume matters to sustaining reform momentum. Still, examples from across the continent highlight how difficult this balance has been to achieve. Countries experiment with stronger frameworks only to see them undermined by old patterns, opaque budgets, politically captured courts, or discretionary licensing. Others sustain progress for decades, but remain vulnerable to swings in global prices or external shocks, testing the resilience of their institutions. By 2025, the gap remains visible. Some states manage relative stability through stronger institutions, while many others remain locked in. Elite-driven cycles. Behind these patterns is a larger dynamic. When rules are extractive, trust erodes. And once trust erodes, people inside and outside the country view the entire system as unreliable. That perception matters as much as the reality, because it shapes whether investors, partners, and citizens believe growth is possible under current governance. And that brings us to another layer of the problem: how weak governance generates barriers that extend beyond domestic politics. The issue is not just money siphoned away by elites, it's what those practices signal to the rest of the world, and how damaging those signals can be. Governance and the reputation problem. Governance and the reputation problem operate as silent but powerful brakes on Africa's economic potential. Corruption is not just a matter of stolen funds or vanished contracts. What makes it deeply damaging is how it shapes expectations, both inside and outside a country. The more unpredictable governments appear, the higher the risks assigned to doing business there. This reputation effect magnifies far beyond the missing money itself, and often locks entire regions into slower growth. Many people picture corruption as a politician pocketing bribes, and sometimes that's accurate. But the broader issue is how each incident broadcasts instability. Every diverted dollar weakens not only public services, but also signals to investors and citizens that rules are negotiable. In practice, this works like a hidden tax, not added formally through law, but imposed through uncertainty. Businesses factor that tax into decisions, sometimes by raising costs, sometimes by walking away entirely. For foreign investors, the signal of corruption frequently outweighs the underlying economics. On paper, a large oil field in Nigeria or a natural gas basin in Mozambique might look enticing. But news about frozen projects, contested contracts, or sudden regulatory shifts reshapes the calculation. Investors start attaching higher risk premiums because they cannot be certain what new government, court decision, or informal power arrangement will mean for their money. As seen recently, geopolitically unstable projects, like the stalled Niger pipeline, can halt investment and derail expected returns overnight. And in today's financial environment, high global interest rates make investors especially cautious. Safer assets elsewhere promise solid returns without political risk, so Africa's riskier opportunities are often skipped over. These external judgments have serious internal consequences. Countries battling corruption find their borrowing costs climb steeply. International lenders fold the risk into higher interest rates, which pushes governments to spend more of their limited revenue servicing debt instead of investing in schools, infrastructure, or healthcare. This siphon widens the gap between what's needed for growth and the money actually available. For citizens, this trickles down into daily life. If you're starting a business or trying to access credit, reputational risk makes banks more reluctant to lend and interest costs higher. That limits opportunity before a venture even begins. Citizens also feel the problem in how they perceive their own governments. Teachers who see their school budgets drained upward lose motivation. Nurses working in underfunded clinics develop a habit of survival through informal methods rather than relying on state support. Public sector morale erodes, and cutting corners becomes normalized. Institutions stop being spaces of service and instead turn into arenas of negotiation, favor trading, or delay. In this way, corruption entrenches itself not just as theft, but as everyday practice, deepening mistrust. The impact is clearest when tied to failed projects. Imagine a major highway project intended to connect a coastal capital with an inland trade hub. Local businesses and farms prepare for reduced transport costs and new access to markets. But halfway through, the project stalls because funds vanish, irregularities plague contracts, or lenders suspend disbursements. Communities end up with half-finished work, rusting equipment, and rising cynicism. Businesses retreat, farmers struggle to repay debts taken on in optimism, and families lose confidence in government promises. When stories like this circulate internationally, the reputational damage multiplies. Investors abroad rarely parse the details of each situation. Instead, they see a pattern: projects collapsing, contracts contested, rules shifting, signs that the environment is risky and unreliable. This can blur very different national realities together. In practice, all 54 African economies risk being perceived as one undifferentiated high-risk zone. Reputational spillover means that even governments working seriously on reform still face elevated costs, simply because of regional association. The reputational penalty isn't quick to fade. A corrupt official might be removed or a new law passed, but lenders and companies look for consistency over years, not isolated signals. This stickiness slows recovery. Countries that improve governance often wait far longer than expected before investor behavior changes. In the meantime, progress feels muted because structural reforms don't translate immediately into lower borrowing costs or higher capital inflows. For leaders trying to attract private finance, this long lag frustrates both planners and the public. The costs also extend across borders. Some leaders present corruption as an internal issue, but the interconnectedness of African economies means one country's governance can disrupt regional hopes. A cross-border railway or energy grid requires cooperation, yet doubts about one partner's stability can grind multilateral projects to a halt. The effect cascades, delays stall trade, potential investors hold back, and integration goals remain unfulfilled. This undermines regional strategies that could otherwise multiply growth for more than one country. For ordinary people, these dynamics translate into opportunities that exist on paper but never materialize. Potential agricultural centers struggle to raise financing. Energy projects that could supply millions remain waiting. Technology firms with innovative products cannot scale without reliable outside partnerships. Here, the opportunity cost is immense. Jobs are not created, wages aren't earned, and local economies stagnate despite theoretical potential. You won't see these losses in GDP tables, but the effects run deep at the community level. What makes this especially difficult is that perception often endures longer than reality. Some African nations have taken real steps toward transparency, building stronger checks and reducing corruption in measurable ways. But old reputations lag and cast a shadow over present improvements. Investors, global banks, and development partners often continue pricing risk based on past images rather than present facts. This gap between reform on the ground and recognition abroad keeps investment scarce, even where change has begun. Ultimately, the visible scandals are more damaging than the sum stolen. They raise the cost of credit, deter new business, and lock governments into heavier debt burdens. The financial impact is compounded because resources are diverted into security and damage control rather than growth. For African citizens, this means governments have less flexibility to focus on welfare, and businesses encounter systematic barriers to expansion. Public trust further decays as perception becomes indistinguishable from reality in daily experience. All of these factors form a sobering picture. Corruption's most destructive legacy lies in reputation. It erodes confidence, reshapes how outsiders see entire regions, and inflates costs across the board, even for countries committed to improvement. The reputational cloud discourages growth precisely when African economies need new investment the most. But governance is not the only external factor limiting opportunity. Even if institutions improve and reputations recover, there are forces entirely outside government control that still constrain growth. Some of the most disruptive challenges come not from within political systems, but from the natural environment itself, where shifts in climate are reshaping livelihoods and undercutting development gains across the continent. When climate turns against you, Africa faces another constraint that cannot be negotiated away. Changing climate patterns are directly reshaping daily life and undermining economic progress. The paradox here is stark. The continent produces the smallest share of global greenhouse gases, yet feels some of the sharpest consequences. According to the World Meteorological Organization, average surface temperatures in Africa during 2024 were about 0.86 degrees Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 mean, and the frequency of climate shocks has already displaced roughly 700,000 people in just 1 year. Unlike wealthier parts of the world, Africa does not have deep reserves of infrastructure or finance to soften these blows. That imbalance makes environmental disruption an economic concern as much as an ecological one. Across much of the continent, farming and pastoral activity remain the backbone of employment. Subsistence plots feed families, commercial crops provide foreign exchange, and herding supports entire communities. This dependence on rainfall and soil means that climate disruptions translate almost instantly into lost income and food shortages. When rains fail, maize fields wither, When floods arrive, stored grain and bridges are swept away. For pastoralists, erratic rain leaves grazing land barren, triggering longer seasonal migrations and conflicts over scarce pasture. Each swing in weather chips away at systems households have relied on for generations, compounding instability. The droughts of 2024 highlight the cost vividly. Southern Africa experienced its worst harvests in years. Zambia's cereal production fell 43% below its 5-year average, while Zimbabwe's dropped by nearly 50%. The immediate effect was a sharp food supply shortfall. That triggered a chain reaction that economists describe as drought, harvest shortfall, price spikes, food insecurity, political unrest. This simple chain is repeated across multiple regions, with local variations, making climate volatility one of the most consistent threats to social stability. Desertification deepens these vulnerabilities over longer horizons. Once productive land gradually loses output as soils degrade under pressure from overuse and longer dry spells. At first, yields just dip slightly and families adapt, but over time the decline forces young workers out of farming altogether. Many move to already crowded cities where jobs are scarce. This migration increases unemployment, fuels informal settlements, and strains urban infrastructure, turning what began as soil erosion into a broader social challenge. At the opposite extreme, floods now strike with increasing intensity. In West Africa and Indian Ocean states, heavy rainfall has repeatedly overwhelmed drainage systems and inundated towns. The economic losses include washed-out roads, ruined crops, and destroyed storage facilities. Infertile or saline soils left behind make recovery even harder. Weak infrastructure magnifies the damage. A storm can erase investments not just in farms, but also in transport links, leaving communities cut off from markets for months. Each year of flooding compounds the financial fragility of families and governments already operating on the edge. Even countries with resource wealth are not spared. Export economies dependent on oil or mining face parallel shocks when hydroelectric dams run dry from weak rainfall or when agricultural zones collapse during drought. In some nations, energy shortages have forced industries offline for days at a time. Those interruptions undermine investor confidence and cut into national revenue streams. A state that looks strong on paper with large mineral reserves quickly finds its fiscal position weaker when climate variability cuts power or reduces food security simultaneously. Food insecurity has become a consistent output of these changing conditions. Economies that once produced enough staples are often pushed into importing large quantities of grain. These imports tie local stability to global markets, where price spikes from conflicts or supply disruptions elsewhere quickly ripple into African cities. When a loaf of bread suddenly costs twice as much, the shock destabilizes households who already spend most of their income on food. Political demonstrations often follow, turning climate stress into governance pressure. The impact spreads beyond farming alone. Financial institutions hesitate to extend loans for rural projects when a single failed season can wipe out repayment ability. Insurance companies either avoid offering coverage or raise prices to unaffordable levels. Investors shy away from putting money into long-term infrastructure in flood-prone regions. The result is that those who have the skills and ambition to grow businesses encounter an invisible wall erected by climate unpredictability. Opportunities remain theoretical rather than realized. Migration becomes the coping strategy for many. Families leave farms no longer able to produce. Enough. Some migrate internally, swelling cities already short on jobs and services. Others cross borders, contributing to regional migration pressures. The consequence is not just a change in where people live, but in the demographics of whole nations. Informal settlements expand, stresses on urban governance multiply, and competition for scarce employment intensifies. Climate migration is thus tied directly to national stability, rather than just being a humanitarian question. Communities are not passive in the face of these threats. Farmers continue to adapt where they can by switching planting dates, experimenting with drought-resistant seed varieties, or investing in basic irrigation. Pastoralists adjust grazing routes to sustain herds longer. But without coordinated national support, even determined efforts falter. Infrastructure to store grain, irrigation channels to stabilize yields, or resilient roads to withstand floods require investment well beyond the capacity of smallholders. Experts emphasize that scaling early warning systems, digital tools, and climate-smart investments is essential. Yet funding and governance gaps prevent those strategies from moving at the scale required. Coastal populations confront added risks as sea levels creep upward. Small rises in water height bring saltwater intrusion, degrading farmland and contaminating drinking water. Fishing communities lose breeding habitats, reducing catches and threatening food supplies. Unlike wealthy nations that can invest billions in seawalls or relocation programs, most African states face limits too severe to implement such measures. This structural inequality leaves large populations in precarious positions, vulnerable to events largely outside their control. The broader development pattern is uneven and unstable. A country may record several years of strong GDP growth, build key roads, or even attract foreign investment, only to see those gains undone when a prolonged drought forces emergency food imports. Governments redirect funds from long-term needs like education or healthcare into crisis relief. The pattern resembles a staircase where each upward step is followed by a sharp drop, erasing momentum and pushing timelines for progress further into the future. While climate threats are not technically insurmountable, they demand resources and coordination on a scale few African economies currently possess. Wealthier nations have the capital to recover from major storms or fund massive adaptation projects. For most African governments, each crisis exhausts reserves and forces ever more dependence on external aid. The gap between the pace of environmental change and the capacity to adapt widens almost every year, reducing resilience even where leadership is committed to solutions. By 2025, climate variability has become one of the most concrete barriers to African development. Droughts erase harvests, floods sweep away infrastructure, and rising seas undermine coastal livelihoods. These forces create repeated setbacks for economies that already struggle with fragile institutions and governance dilemmas. The continent's smallest contribution to emissions stands in stark contrast to the scale of its exposure. Ordinary households bear the brunt of shocks they did little to cause, finding their plans overturned again and again. The deeper challenge is that climate shocks don't arrive in isolation. They combine with other financial and institutional weaknesses, straining governments already operating under severe fiscal pressure. And when environmental disruption meets fragile state budgets, the question shifts from how to adapt to how to pay, a shift that directs attention to one of the heaviest burdens African nations now carry: debt and the new global players. Why do so many African governments see more money flowing outward than inward, even in years of strong resource exports? The explanation lies less in trade than in finance, specifically debt. Over decades, uneven growth and heavy borrowing from external lenders have built obligations that consume large pieces of public revenue each year. Instead of fueling new investments, a significant share of income now leaves the continent in the form of repayments. The outcome is an economy that appears in motion but makes little forward progress. Infrastructure explains much of this dynamic. Big-ticket projects, ports, highways, power plants, and rail networks require capital far beyond what tax bases can cover. External loans step in, often faster than domestic financing could, but the terms tie governments to repayment schedules stretching years into the future. In practice, interest costs pile up while projects take time to show benefits. Some loans require that funds be spent on contractors from the creditor country itself, limiting local job creation. At the outset, these deals seem to promise modernization. Later, they weigh heavily on budgets already stretched thin. One of the most important players has been China, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative. Since its launch in 2013, BRI projects worldwide have involved more than $1.3 trillion in cumulative engagement. Across Africa, this produced visible results: new railways in East Africa, port facilities, and energy infrastructure. For many governments, such finance offered a lifeline when traditional lenders were less forthcoming. Yet the deals were not uniform. Some projects delivered important growth opportunities, while others faltered or underperformed, leaving the debt on the books without the revenue streams expected to cover it. BRI projects often provide quick infrastructure financing, but sometimes tie contracts to Chinese firms and complicate debt restructuring. This nuance is clear from recent renegotiations. Treating these loans can feel like paying only the minimum on a credit card. Governments send regular payments to keep relationships afloat, but the principal remains large, and the weight does not ease. Debt service now occupies a central position in budgets, narrowing choices for everything else. For education, that can mean classrooms without funds to hire additional teachers. For health, it can mean shortfalls in vaccine supplies. For road networks, it can mean deteriorating surfaces that undercut the very infrastructure once hailed as a success. For a young adult looking at public finances in 2025, this translates directly into fewer jobs created, reduced education budgets, and limited support for new businesses. Debt also shapes how leaders plan, or fail to plan, for the long term. With so much revenue already committed, governments hesitate to fund costly, slow-return projects like national irrigation systems or new public health systems. Instead, they pivot toward short-term measures that can be managed within constrained budgets. While this may keep finances stable in the present, it delays the structural projects most capable of lifting economies over decades. That imbalance shows why heavy debt creates not only an economic burden, but also a political one. The influence of creditors further complicates sovereignty. International bond markets adjust borrowing costs based on rating agencies' views of risk. Lower ratings often mean double-digit interest rates, which in turn force states to set aside even more revenue for interest. Countries such as Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia, and Ghana have all had to restructure their debts under the G20 Common Framework. These episodes illustrate that unsustainable obligations are not abstract. They are very present, and they carry high social and economic costs. Each restructuring highlights that repayment terms, not just original loan conditions, shape the space governments have to manage their economies. China's role here is mixed rather than one-dimensional. Some loans have been criticized for tying repayment to strategic assets and for favoring Chinese contractors. Others have supplied critical infrastructure that might not exist otherwise. In restructuring talks, this nuance appears again. Flexibility is sometimes granted, but repayment obligations remain non-negotiable. Balancing short-term access to capital with long-term debt sustainability has become one of the most pressing financial challenges across the continent. Many African governments continue to seek financing from Beijing, acknowledging both the opportunities and the risks. For citizens, the costs are less theoretical. A delay in agricultural investment may stretch food insecurity longer than expected. A cut to health spending leaves clinics short on supplies. Families paying rising school fees experience the knock-on effects of budgets reoriented toward creditors. From the outside, these may look unrelated, but collectively they represent the invisible opportunity costs of external borrowing. Debt doesn't just remove money from countries, it removes chances for families to escape poverty. There is also a psychological layer. The repeated necessity of new borrowing to cover old loans normalizes dependence. Citizens see promises of transformation tied to finance agreements, yet experience little visible change in daily conditions. This cycle generates skepticism about whether borrowing is for genuine development or elite networks aligned with global lenders. Confidence in government capacity erodes, shaping how people view both leaders and external partners. That said, there are experiments showing paths forward. Some governments are pursuing debt-for-nature swaps, agreeing to redirect obligations toward climate preservation efforts in exchange for relief. Others seek to negotiate new terms through multilateral channels, stretching repayment horizons to allow domestic budgets some breathing room. Regional institutions have also begun offering modest alternatives, although not at the scale needed to offset global financing demands. These approaches show creativity, but underline that reversing debt accumulation is a long journey. By 2025, debt remains one of the most significant constraints on African growth. Servicing obligations consumes billions that might expand schools, fund hospitals, or fuel entrepreneurial startup programs. Where loans provided infrastructure, the results often came at the cost of long-term fiscal space. The contradiction is clear. Borrowing aimed at development often ends by limiting future development capacity. The weight is not evenly distributed, but its presence is felt widely across the continent. This financial reality also intersects with another persistent challenge. Heavy debt loads restrict public sectors from creating opportunities that match the ambitions of their younger citizens. For many skilled workers, the absence of reliable prospects encourages them to seek opportunities elsewhere. That outward flow of talent has become one of the continent's most pressing economic dilemmas, compounding the very strains debt creates internally. The brain drain problem. Another major barrier lies in the flight of skilled people, often described as Africa's brain drain problem. Doctors, engineers, and scientists trained on the continent frequently choose to continue their careers abroad. The choice is less about personal loyalty and more about practical conditions. Abroad, they find higher pay, modern equipment, reliable infrastructure, and predictable career paths. At home, wages remain low, facilities are underfunded, and political or economic instability makes long-term planning difficult. Taken together, these push and pull factors make leaving less of an emotional decision and more of a rational calculation. African governments are not indifferent to this pattern, and many invest heavily in education, hoping to build a workforce strong enough to meet national development needs. Universities churn out medical, engineering, and science graduates while governments expand technical and vocational programs. The expectation is that this talent will reinforce health systems, modernize industries, and drive innovation. Yet just as graduates reach the point where their expertise could make a domestic impact, many depart. As a result, societies fund years of training only to see the benefits accrue elsewhere. The loss is twofold. Local institutions are deprived of competent professionals, and the original investment in education does not yield returns at home. The scale is most visible in healthcare. Training a doctor is one of the most expensive and time-consuming public investments a country can make. But when trained doctors migrate, home health systems face shortages that directly affect life and death outcomes. In rural regions, facilities often operate with just a handful of nurses or without any qualified doctor at all. Patients must travel long distances, wait hours for attention, or go untreated. Behind every departure is not only a professional seeking better tools, but also communities left more vulnerable. The same applies to nurses and specialists whose absence limits hospitals' capacity to respond to crises or expand services. Information technology and engineering provide another stark example. Graduates in these fields, often educated with up-to-date skills, find limited opportunities at home. Domestic firms may be small, under-resourced, or constrained by weak infrastructure. In contrast, companies abroad offer fast-growing tech environments, competitive pay, and structured career ladders. The result is that some of the very people best equipped to bridge Africa's digital divide are instead building systems elsewhere. For energy and manufacturing, where talent is scarce and technological adoption is critical, the result is stalled projects and slower adoption of efficiency-enhancing innovations. This steady outward flow creates a cycle hard to break. Workplaces weaken when professionals leave, making conditions worse for those who remain. That deterioration encourages further departures. Over time, institutions lack not just numbers, but the critical core of experienced professionals able to train, lead, and innovate. Without that layer of mentorship and applied skill, development programs face constant setbacks. It becomes not just a shortage of personnel, but a shortage of possibilities, where potential projects never move past plans because capacity is too thin. The paradox is that migration drains skills but also re-injects some benefits through connections abroad. Modern communications and financial systems mean Africans overseas rarely sever ties completely. Remittances flow back at scale, strengthening household budgets and local economies. The GSMA reported that remittances sent to sub-Saharan Africa reached roughly $29 billion in 2023, much of it enabled through mobile money and digital transfers. These funds often cover school fees, medical care, housing, or seed money for family businesses. The same doctor who left Lagos for work in New York may send money that educates younger relatives or sustains community initiatives. In this way, migration both subtracts and supplements development. Beyond money, diaspora communities contribute knowledge and opportunities. They establish research partnerships, secure places for students in foreign institutions, and link domestic startups with international markets. A software engineer working in London may connect firms in Nairobi to investors, while a scientist based in Toronto can collaborate virtually with colleagues back in Accra. Technology has reduced the distance between those abroad and those at home, making ongoing participation feasible even after migration. These ties complicate the notion of permanent loss, as talent outside borders can still play active roles in national development. However, relying too heavily on diaspora networks creates its own vulnerabilities. Global crises can suddenly cut remittance flows or make cross-border collaboration more difficult. For example, when global recessions hit, migrants abroad may tighten personal budgets, meaning less money sent home. Dependence on external connections thus exposes households and governments to risks beyond their control. The returns, though valuable, seldom replace the irreplaceable impact of having skilled professionals physically embedded in local institutions. The deeper concern is generational perception. When young people repeatedly see their role models leave, success becomes associated with departure. Staying behind comes to look like compromising ambitions. This cultural expectation perpetuates the cycle. Students plan their education as a route abroad rather than as a basis for careers at home. Over decades, the psychological signal may be as damaging as the numbers lost, reinforcing the idea that the continent's most talented must look outward to thrive. In response, governments experiment with several strategies. Some increase salaries and improve working conditions for critical professions like doctors and teachers. Others create business incubators or research centers designed to provide domestic opportunities more closely aligned with international standards. A few implement incentive schemes, housing support, guaranteed posts, tax breaks for professionals willing to return. Results have been mixed. Some individuals do come back, motivated by family ties or patriotic drive, but the scale rarely reverses broader flows. Structural weaknesses in financing, governance, or infrastructure often overshadow the benefits of targeted policies. A lower-cost option gaining traction is to leverage diaspora contributions without requiring physical return. Governments and think tanks stress the possibility of structured diaspora engagement. This can involve inviting professionals to deliver remote guest lectures, participate in short-term consultancies, or invest in pooled funds for startups back home. Brookings and other policy centers note that diaspora-led investment, skills transfer, and collaboration models are already underway in various sectors. By formalizing channels for such initiatives, governments can tap into global expertise and financing without requiring permanent relocation. Technology makes this far more feasible than in past decades, and the challenge is often less about possibility than about creating the right organizational frameworks. Despite growing recognition of these opportunities, brain drain still imposes heavy costs. Limited workforces undermine sectors that need steady expansion to keep pace with population growth. Health services, infrastructure programs, and tech ecosystems move slower because core teams remain thin. At the same time, the reliance on remittances, while essential for many families, cannot substitute for robust, self-sufficient local systems. The push to frame migration as an asset through diaspora engagement is promising, but it requires careful design to ensure benefits reach beyond individual households and strengthen institutions directly. By 2025, the problem remains unsolved. Africa continues to educate skilled talent that often departs, redistributing benefits unevenly between home and host countries. Families and small communities benefit from remittance flows, while national development suffers from a shortage of the very professionals needed to improve systems at scale. The continent faces a mixed reality where talent both leaves and contributes, but rarely in balances that transform underlying weaknesses. Until working conditions at home approach the opportunities offered abroad, this tension will persist. Yet within this challenge lies another possibility. The same networks and technologies that keep migrants connected to their families also open unexpected paths for economic transformation. What feels like a limitation may also provide tools for building new systems of growth that operate differently from the traditional models, breaking the cycle with innovation. Innovation has become one of the most promising ways to reframe Africa's economic future. For decades, the continent was often described in terms of deficits, shortages of infrastructure, weak institutions, or fragile economies. But in recent years, some of the most significant changes have come not from external aid or commodity booms, but from homegrown technological shifts. Nowhere is this more visible than in the rise of mobile-based platforms that cut across barriers once thought immovable. Traditional banking illustrates how exclusion shaped daily life. For much of the population, especially in rural areas, opening an account required long travel, extensive paperwork, and fees that few could afford. Entire communities lived outside formal finance, forced to rely on cash systems that made saving risky and borrowing nearly impossible. This kept small businesses from expanding and households from building buffers against shocks. Without access to credit or secure transfers, poverty reproduced itself in familiar cycles. The turning point came with mobile money. Instead of requiring bricks-and-mortar branches, services like Kenya's M-Pesa use the phone as a bank. Originally underestimated as a niche experiment, M-Pesa quickly gained mass adoption. By allowing people to store, send, and receive money electronically, it bypassed decades of banking exclusion. Families could save small amounts securely. Workers could send remittances to relatives across the country at low cost. Small entrepreneurs could pay suppliers and receive payments without dealing with large sums of cash. Rigorous studies by Tavneet Suri and William Jack showed that access to M-Pesa helped households smooth consumption after shocks and contributed to measurable reductions in poverty rates. What began as a novel tool became a foundation for wider economic participation. The speed of adoption was unmatched. Within a few years, mobile accounts not only rivaled, but surpassed bank accounts in several countries. By 2024, according to the GSMA, Africa's mobile money sector had grown to 2.1 billion registered accounts globally, with around 514 million monthly active accounts and $1.68 trillion in transactions. These figures make clear that what started as an alternative has become one of the central financial systems on the continent. Millions of transactions once done informally or not at all now pass through traceable, efficient digital channels. This new infrastructure unlocked opportunities far beyond finance. Farmers able to receive payments electronically reinvested in inputs for the next harvest, improving productivity. Market vendors could record transactions digitally, making their income visible to lenders who might extend credit. Remittance flows from relatives abroad strengthened local purchasing power directly, enabling families to pay school fees, build homes, or start micro-businesses. What once required expensive intermediaries or unreliable couriers could now be managed with a few keystrokes on a basic phone. Entrepreneurs seized on this digital foundation. Startups designed services tailored to local needs, often created by young Africans drawing directly on personal experience. Health platforms connected rural patients to urban doctors through telemedicine. Educational startups offered remote learning to students lacking adequate schools. Simple delivery apps reduced friction in local trade. These ventures were not imported solutions but local adaptations, built in environments of scarcity but scaled through dense mobile penetration. Innovation became a practical response to underdevelopment. A critical aspect is how digital records create financial visibility. For decades, banks hesitated to lend to low-income families or small vendors, citing lack of documentation. Mobile money changed that by generating transaction histories at scale. Lenders could now assess risk based on patterns of payments rather than on collateral, extending loans to first-time borrowers who had previously been invisible to the system. This change expanded access to credit in ways traditional institutions had not achieved despite years of effort. Remittances highlight another clear payoff. Previously, families waited days or weeks for transfers sent through expensive operators. Mobile platforms reduced costs, accelerated speed, and made money instantly available. The result was flows of billions of dollars moving directly into households, bypassing leaks in the system. In 2023, remittances to sub-Saharan Africa reached around $29 billion, with much of it routed through mobile-enabled channels. The difference is not abstract. School fees get paid on time, small shops remain stocked, and emergencies are handled without catastrophic losses. Youth participation amplifies this transformation. With the median age on the continent below 20, mobile technology is often the first step young people take into the economy. Phones represent not only communication but entry into commerce, finance, and entrepreneurship. Many young innovators start ventures grounded in digital tools, connecting farmers to buyers, managing cooperative savings groups, or creating local training platforms. Their fluency with technology allows them to adapt faster than older institutions, making youth a central driver in the ongoing shift. International perceptions are changing as well. Investors who once dismissed Africa as too risky or underdeveloped now see thriving startups and expanding adoption rates. Venture capital has flowed into hubs like Lagos, Nairobi, and Cape Town. Though small compared to Asia or North America, these investments reflect recognition of a new environment. Instead of waiting for infrastructure or large-scale external projects, local entrepreneurs are building growth platforms themselves. This challenges old narratives that innovation only diffuses inward from wealthier regions. Yet challenges remain. Coverage gaps persist in rural zones where network infrastructure is costly to extend. Regulatory frameworks continue to lag behind innovation. In some cases, policy choices have slowed adoption. For instance, academic critiques note that mobile money taxation in Kenya reduced transaction volumes by raising costs for low-income users. This shows that even successful systems remain vulnerable to policy errors that can erode accessibility. At the same time, debates continue over data privacy, consumer protection, and financial stability as platforms carry ever larger volumes of money. Still, the net gains are undeniable. Millions excluded from finance now move money with ease. Businesses once frozen by lack of credit now access small loans and expand. Households that weather shocks more effectively contribute to local stability. These are not incremental changes but structural ones, reshaping how African economies function at the base level. The effect is visible every day as ordinary transactions, once invisible, now pass through reliable, scalable systems. What makes this shift important is not just the technology itself, but the broader lesson it illustrates. Innovation thrives when constraints force new approaches. Africa's lack of entrenched banking infrastructure, once seen as a disadvantage, became the opening for mobile-led growth. By creating systems tailored to their conditions, African societies have shown that scarcity can produce unique pathways forward. This offers a template for how adaptation, rather than imitation, might define the continent's longer-term trajectory. By 2025, digital platforms, mobile money, and startup-driven services are not add-ons, but core pieces of many African economies. Phones that once symbolized connectivity now serve as gateways to savings, credit, healthcare, and education. Far from being marginal, these innovations have grown into pillars of everyday life. They make clear that African development cannot be reduced to a single story of dependency or scarcity, because entire systems of access and opportunity have already been rebuilt from the ground up. And while many obstacles clearly remain, such as governance challenges, climate pressures, and debt burdens, these innovations demonstrate that transformation is possible. Structural change is not limited to theoretical models or foreign interventions. It is happening in practice, with measurable effects. The question then becomes not only where problems lie, but where solutions are working, and what lessons might be drawn from those successes to guide future development. Bright spots and lessons learned. When African economies are discussed, the conversation often concentrates on poverty, conflict, and fragility. But not every country has moved in the same direction. A few examples stand out for charting relatively stable paths despite facing the same obstacles as their neighbors. These cases are not flawless, yet they show how choices about governance, institutions, and resource management shape outcomes. Looking closely at them highlights what happens when accountability rises and public decisions are made with longer horizons in mind. Rwanda is one of the most notable examples. In the 1990s, it was nearly destroyed by genocide. Social and political systems collapsed, and trust appeared broken beyond repair. Yet in the years that followed, Rwanda rebuilt with an unusual degree of state discipline. The government streamlined its civil service, enforced audits with uncommon rigor, and signaled intolerance toward petty corruption. International partners noted that money passing through government agencies was monitored more closely than in much of the region. These changes were not cosmetic. They gradually created an environment where contracts were more likely to be honored and administrative delays were reduced. According to Chatham House research, Rwanda implemented strong governance reforms, attracted sustained investment, and made political stability and state capacity priorities, even as elections remained contested. The result was rapid growth, diversification into agribusiness and tourism, and recognition as a country where the rule of law felt more predictable. For an ordinary Rwandan, this translated into more reliable public services and modest, but expanding work opportunities. Ghana illustrates a different path, built less on administrative discipline and more on digital momentum. While still carrying a large debt burden and commodity volatility, Ghana identified fintech as an emerging sector with transformative potential. Over the past decade, Accra gained a reputation as a hub for regional financial technology. By supporting mobile payments, digital banking platforms, and startups building small business apps, Ghana built one of the continent's more robust digital ecosystems. Policy Center research emphasizes that this growth aligned with the African Continental Free Trade Area's push for cross-border digital trade and African Development Bank backing for entrepreneurship. The effect has been concrete for citizens. Small vendors gaining access to mobile loans, consumers making routine payments at lower cost, and government services testing digital upgrades. For investors, it created a sense that Ghana's economy was not tied entirely to cocoa or gold swings, but supported by a broader and faster-moving sector. Botswana, by contrast, faced the traditional resource paradox, yet avoided the extremes suffered elsewhere. At independence, it was one of the poorest countries in the world, with little infrastructure and few institutions. Then diamonds changed its fortunes. Unlike neighbors who saw booms collapse under corruption or mismanagement, Botswana set rules that directed resource revenues into the state budget rather than private accounts. It also launched the Pula Fund, a sovereign wealth fund that invested surpluses abroad, creating long-term savings and stabilization reserves. Part of diamond revenue was directed into health and education, increasing human capital alongside financial capital. Coupled with its relatively stable democratic governance, this fiscal discipline allowed Botswana to sustain steady growth for decades. The result has been predictable institutions and consistently funded social programs. For ordinary citizens, it has meant reasonably reliable schools, healthcare investments, and a reputation that reassures potential employers and partners. These stories are not without reservations. Rwanda's political system has been criticized for limited freedoms. Ghana remains tied to debt cycles and struggles to diversify fully. Botswana still faces inequality and dependence on diamonds. Yet their trajectories illustrate how much depends on governance and institutional choices. Chatham House, Policy Center, and World Bank studies all stress that such decisions determine whether resources fuel development or perpetuate fragility. Citizens and investors respond when they see systems operating with rules that are enforced, budgets that align with projects, and long-term commitments honored. That trust creates a compounding effect. People are more willing to pay taxes, businesses invest, and outside capital views opportunities as more credible. The lesson is pragmatic. Geography or raw resources do not lock countries into poverty. Outcomes diverge because of the paths leaders choose and the institutions they build. For viewers, that matters because it translates into lived experiences. Better job prospects when education spending is sustained, steadier services when public resources are monitored, and clearer investment environments whether you are a local entrepreneur or an outside partner. Research-backed evidence from Rwanda, Ghana, and Botswana makes clear that resilience is possible, but it requires long-term discipline. These examples show that governance and resource management choices, not resource endowments alone, explain why some economies provide stability while others remain volatile. Strong institutions can transform limited advantages into sustained improvements. For citizens, that means more predictable futures. For investors, less uncertainty. And for societies, a chance to escape repeating cycles of fragility. The broader question is how those insights intersect with Africa's present realities. While institutions and governance set the framework, another force will increasingly shape the continent's path. That force is demographic change. An immense population shift with the power to either reinforce existing pressures or open an entirely different trajectory for economic growth. The power of demographics. In most of the world, the economic conversation is dominated by aging societies. Europe, North America, and parts of Asia are grappling with the costs of pensions, healthcare, and smaller workforces. Africa stands apart. It is the youngest continent, with nearly 70% of people in sub-Saharan Africa under the age of 30, according to UN and Brookings data. Over the next 25 years, about 800 million Africans are projected to join the workforce. That demographic scale has no parallel in today's global economy, and it changes how analysts think about the continent's potential. The presence of so many young people creates both opportunity and risk. A large, energetic workforce can support industries, innovation, and growing consumer demand. Entire economies could be lifted if education, jobs, and health systems keep pace. But the opposite is also possible. If millions of young adults reach working age without clear career prospects, frustration will rise. Political systems may come under pressure, and instability could follow. The same numbers that could drive prosperity might instead fuel discontent if managed poorly. The concept often described here is the demographic dividend. Research from Brookings and the World Economic Forum explains it in straightforward terms. A demographic dividend emerges when education, jobs, and health services expand quickly enough to convert population growth into higher productivity and stable consumption. It is conditional, not automatic. Without these systems in place, the dividend looks more like a demographic burden. For governments, the central challenge is turning numbers into human capital. Young Africans entering the workforce will only add momentum if their skills match what economies demand. Education is where that begins. Schools that lack materials, teachers, or basic infrastructure make it difficult to prepare students for participation in modern labor markets. Higher education brings similar risks. If universities produce degrees disconnected from labor demand, say, thousands of graduates competing for jobs that do not exist, it only feeds dissatisfaction. By contrast, aligning training with sectors like technology, renewable energy, or healthcare gives young workers pathways that lead somewhere tangible. Employment growth is just as critical. Each year, millions of students complete their education and begin looking for work. If industries expand slowly, most of them will be funneled into informal sectors, where jobs are unstable, low-paying, and offer little upward mobility. In such economies, ambition often collides with barriers that are structural rather than personal. A demographic dividend can only unfold if formal, sustainable employment grows fast enough to absorb new entrants. Otherwise, the gap between expectations and available opportunities produces lasting economic inefficiency and political strain. Urbanization adds to the complexity. Cities across the continent, Lagos, Nairobi, Kinshasa, are magnets for youth pursuing work and education. When urban growth is matched by planning, infrastructure, and housing expansion, cities generate economic dynamism. But when planning lags, informal settlements become the default solution for millions. These settlements often lack water, electricity, or reliable transit. Employment becomes casual, housing insecure, and public services overstretched. For governments, the ability to harness demographic power depends in part on how well they manage urban inflows without letting infrastructure collapse under the strain. If conditions align properly, the outcome can be self-reinforcing. Young people who receive training and employment spend more, and that spending creates demand across sectors. Small businesses expand to meet rising consumer power, larger industries scale up production, and governments receive more tax revenue to invest back into education and healthcare. This cycle generates both confidence and stability. But if jobs remain scarce, the cycle reverses. Incomes stagnate, consumption slows, and political unrest mounts. Demographic change doesn't guarantee progress. It magnifies the direction of whatever systems are already in place. Health is another part of this story. Young populations cost less in pensions and old age care compared to aging societies, but they require broad-based investments in child nutrition, maternal care, and preventive services. Neglecting these layers has permanent consequences. An undernourished child is less likely to succeed in school and less likely to contribute to high productivity later in life. Research emphasizes that a healthy young population is not simply a welfare priority, but an economic strategy. A workforce that arrives sick, undernourished, or stunted cannot become the basis of long-term growth. Digital access is also reshaping how this generation interacts with opportunity. The spread of affordable mobile phones and the internet has given millions early entry into global culture and markets. Teenagers in Accra or Dar es Salaam see online how peers elsewhere live, sparking both expectations and ideas. For some, this pressure makes local inequalities more visible. For others, it enables entrepreneurial solutions. Across Kenya and Nigeria, for example, young innovators have built mobile-based businesses in commerce, health, and education. The digital space is no longer a side story. It has become a direct entry point for youth into the formal economy. For viewers considering their own finances or careers, demographics translate into clear opportunity. More young people means more future customers, more entrepreneurs, and more skilled colleagues. For anyone interested in startups, jobs, or investing, Africa's demographic momentum signals expanding markets. At the micro level, this matters to personal strategy just as much as to national plans. Growth in numbers reshapes what economic niches are viable and which industries will scale. Still, the potential scale of population change is daunting. By mid-century, Africa is expected to host one of the largest youth populations the world has ever seen. It could form the world's greatest workforce, or one of its largest unemployed blocks. The trajectory comes down to policy choices, consistent investment in education systems, labor markets, and public health. Brookings' analysis is clear. The dividend emerges only when governments invest in these foundations. Without that investment, population growth heightens inequality instead of broadening prosperity. International comparisons help illustrate the point. East Asia in the late 20th century turned a similar youth wave into economic expansion through manufacturing, integration into global trade, and major education investments. South Korea and Singapore illustrate how a young workforce can become a global advantage if opportunities exist. Africa's conditions are different, less industrial base, more climate vulnerability, but the principle stands. Demographics provide potential, not guarantees. The outcomes are already diverging within Africa. Nigeria and Ethiopia face massive youth inflows, but have not consistently translated them into formal jobs. Rwanda has used governance reforms and technology adoption to better integrate young workers, though at a smaller scale. Ghana has expanded its digital economy, providing opportunities for younger cohorts in fintech and services. These variations show that demographics don't force a single outcome. Leadership, investment priorities, and governance strength shape whether numbers become an asset or a drag. By 2025, youth have become central to the continent's economic dilemma. The next decades will be shaped by whether governments view population growth as a liability or as an asset requiring sustained investment. If educational systems collapse under demand or formal job growth lags, discontent will rise. But countries that coordinate training, urban planning, and youth employment could unlock sustained growth of a scale unavailable to aging societies. The balance remains fragile. Ultimately, the question is not whether Africa's young populations will shape the future. They already are, but whether institutions and policies will provide them the tools to succeed. In that sense, demographics reflect the same truth visible across all the challenges we have explored. Progress depends on design, governance, and consistent choices. And this leads naturally to the final point. Outcomes are not pre-written. Poverty or growth is not inevitable. What happens in Africa will depend on how its leaders and institutions respond to this moment. Just as what happens in personal finance depends on the choices and structures we set for ourselves. Africa's poverty is not a destiny written in stone. It stems from choices, fragile governance, extractive institutions, and environmental pressures. Yet the evidence shows that when institutions and technology are strengthened, demographic and digital trends can become powerful engines for growth. Opportunities emerge where systems are predictable, rules are fair, and people trust they can plan for tomorrow. Success builds on itself. Progress in one decade makes the next step easier. Drop one country or innovation that surprised you in the comments and explain why. Remember, natural wealth alone won't lift lives. Rules, systems, and people do.